Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody, wherever you are. My name is Greg Bailey, and we want to welcome you to today's session that Lloyd Norman is going to be presenting today. Just a few housekeeping items. You will get a copy of the presentation at the end of the session, along with the recording. And if you do have any questions throughout the session, feel free to put them in the question box that you've got in your GoToMeeting there. So with that, I'd like to introduce Lloyd Norman, who's Vice President of Strategic Solutions at Prosymmetry. Prior to joining Prosymmetry, Lloyd directed the Resource Management Office at a top financial institution where he architected an enterprise resource planning ecosystem that continuously aligns strategic projects, agile initiatives, and operational work with vital delivery and governance resources. Lloyd has over 25 years of experience delivering value in the RMO and PMO leadership roles as managing partner in a technology professional services firm and as a consultant with IBM. As an entrepreneurial leader, Lloyd has consulted with clients in a variety of industries, including banking, aerospace, healthcare, DoD, manufacturing, oil and gas, and technology. He spent 5 years on the Resource Management Institute Advisory Board, has LPM, CSM, PMP, RMCP certifications, and has a bachelor's degree in industrial engineering from the University of Oklahoma. We're excited to have Lloyd with us, and Lloyd, would like you to take it away.
Thank you, Greg. I appreciate it, and thanks to all that have taken time out of your busy days to attend today. We'll cut right to the heart of the matter because I know that your time is important, and the topic is very important. It's very timely, right? A little bit of an introduction, if I may, on Tempus. Let me make sure that I'm rocking and rolling here. Hopefully you can see that. This slide just shows, in particular, many of our clients. We're a global company. We have hundreds of organizations that are using our software. And they use it basically to make sure that they can continuously align work and people to maximize value delivery. And that's really regardless of whether they're working in an operational environment, somebody like an audit firm or whatever, pure professional services, or whether they're a more complex IT organization, supporting product delivery, and they're doing both waterfall projects, agile initiatives, and of course, everybody has operational work. So a very broad sector of support for the things that we're going to be talking about today. So let me throw this out here. This is always good for discussion. I realize this is more of a one-way discussion, but I would encourage you all. Greg's going to be monitoring the chat board. So if you have questions as we go, please put them in there. I'm definitely planning on leaving time at the end of this discussion. We will be done in an hour, I can assure you, including questions. But if you have any, just put them in there, and we'll get to those at the end of the presentation. This is a really interesting statistic that I uncovered, and it's consistent with the consulting work that we're doing all over the world. A lot of people for a long time have been looking at Agile. Most on this call are likely familiar with the heritage of Agile, the group of wizards, if you will. They got together in Park City in 2001. I'm actually from the Salt Lake City area, and their last year, the 20th anniversary of that was celebrated, and some interesting discussions there by many of the principals that signed the original Agile Manifesto. But here's the challenge that we're seeing now, even 20 years later, right? People are trying to figure out how to scale Agile effectively. And what is really the key to making this work at scale? And by the way, many resources aren't really able to adjust to our Agile methodologies, certainly yet, perhaps maybe ever. Specifically, compliance, audit, regulatory, legal, the business partners, certain entities within organizations that are heavily scrutinized by regulatory bodies. It's just very difficult because they're timeline driven, right? How do I get them to flow into Agile? And I think for those and many other reasons, this particular quote and statistic is very interesting, that Agile methods have fallen prey to the same impediments that have traditionally troubled projects and are experiencing approximately the same success rate. And believe me, you can go out on the web and you can find people that'll tell you that, look, Agile, success rates are notably higher, and certainly among given groups they are. But the IPMA is certainly a well-known organization, and so I would just throw this out here as a data point for discussion. Today, I want to talk about scaled resource planning in particular and the value it brings in a scaled Agile delivery environment, because it really does glue things together. If people will follow best practices for scaled Agile delivery, and if you are in a hybrid environment, best practices for resource and roadmap planning in waterfall delivery, in operational delivery, you'll see that it can tie together to allow you to plan on a common timeline. The things that we're talking about today are in fact going to be very consistent. For those of you that are familiar with the Scaled Agile framework, this obviously is a screenshot directly from their website. I would refer you directly to them. Wonderful people, wonderful approach for scaling Agile. I realize there are multiple approaches, Scrum of Scrums, LAS, yada, yada, yada. I'm kind of picking on this to be representative of the fact that resource planning is not inconsistent with scaled Agile delivery. In fact, as in version 5.1 of the SAFE framework, it's actually a fundamental part of it, and we'll talk about that. All right, a little bit of background here. Again, I suspect that most people on this call know this, but look, teams, they plan in sprints. They're valuable for what they do on their own, but they're more valuable when they work together in a coordinated way through a release train. Release trains essentially exist because they are associated with value streams in whatever organization you're working in. You have hopefully gone through considerable effort to align your value streams with whatever your product or services may be, whether your customer is internal or external, doesn't really matter. If it's any kind of delivery team, if you will, it's related work, and the teams work together on a train to deliver as much value as they can consistently. Now, on top of that function, you've got lean portfolio management. Excuse me. And I realize that in many organizations, they just call it portfolio management. Certainly, if you're attempting to follow the Scaled Agile framework, the lean portfolio management moniker is very prominent. So I'll be referring to that today, but it really is synonymous with overall portfolio management. And here's the deal with portfolio management. Ideally, if you're working in a pure Agile environment, which frankly, few people are. If you are in a pure Agile environment, I say bless you, that's wonderful. But you are in rarefied air. Most people are working in some sort of a hybrid environment, or they're implementing the concepts of Agile in some way that is challenged, if you will, relative to an Agile purist. The concept for Agile, of course, being that you're bringing work to people as opposed to sort of the traditional waterfall flow where you're bringing people to work, right? Where you're typically supplying resources from cross-functionally supporting managers to deliver your work. I would submit to you that lean portfolio management should be concerned with both of those scenarios. They should be looking at how do I bring work to people and people to work. And there's good ways that you can do that, assuming that you're following best practices. What you're going to see today, and what I'm going to talk about, is not necessarily breathtakingly new in terms of what's being asked for best practices. The challenge with a lot of these best practices is that they're a little bit ivory tower, if you will. They'll lay this out there about, this is the ideal, but they don't really provide specifics on how to do it. I tend to be a bit more pragmatic, and we're going to take a pragmatic approach to this today and talk about what are some of the best practices and actually how you do this so you can, in fact, have truly adaptive portfolio management. So why do I talk about this? Because, in fact, this is typical of my life experience in terms of how both Agile and waterfall projects might be being delivered in many, many places today. Again, we consult with people, our client base is all over the world, so we get a representative cross-section of this. Some will not be this dynamic. Others are quite a bit more dynamic than this. And the general notion here is, look, if you've got a portfolio, in this particular case, we've got 6 of them, right? We've got some enabling portfolios over here. We've got customer portfolios over here. If you've got a federal portfolio, hopefully, if you've done your value stream mapping correctly, most of your work's going to be flowing through the federal products art, right? In this case, we've got 3 teams, a civil team, a technology team, and a mechanical team. But the reality is, most arts, at best, a really productive art is going to align about 75 to 80% of the time with a single portfolio, right? They're going to have to go out 20 to 25% of the time, possibly more, depending on the nature of the art, to entities outside of the art to get things done. Shared services, right? The whole Scaled Agile Framework model talks about how do you plan for shared services? Where do you plan for shared services? How might you incorporate working with people from finance, accounting, or legal? Their best practice, of course, submits that we should try to get finance, accounting, and legal to start to work and plan on a consistent basis, consistent with the rest of our PI planning right across the enterprise. And I would submit to you and say, good luck. Again, if you are living and breathing in an organization that has made that commitment, you are again breathing rarefied air. Even if they've made that commitment, oftentimes the nature of their work doesn't allow them to consistently attend portfolio planning events. So you've got to account for that, right? And I put this project in blue here representing, look, it's a project, not an epic. Lots of times we see people that are transitioning or they've gone as far as they can in terms of the agile transition in their company before they, the headwaters are just too deep and the current's too strong against them to make any more progress. And so they might be asked to support waterfall projects at the same time, right? So in this particular example, I'm showing the commercial portfolio has a waterfall project that is also vying for the same resources that the federal art is, right? And what it comes down to, obviously, if you're doing this across all of these, right, this chart's going to look unintelligible, unreadable, even if only 25% of your work is doing that kind of sharing. I routinely meet with organizations that have scores of arts. Average size organizations might have 12 to 20. I meet with consistently, with teams that are 60 to 80 arts, right? Just kind of depends. So let's talk about scaled resource planning and how it might let you be agile while you're doing agile, because I would submit to you that there's a difference. If you're actually being agile, you ought to be able to continuously deliver the greatest value from whatever your available pool of resources is. You ought to also be able to cogently and coherently explain where you might be able to add resources, because my experience is that, look, even though one of the fundamental tenets of Agile is we have persistent teams and they are fixed in size. If you are able to explain to a senior level executive that, look, if I could add 2 more people to this team, or even add another team, or even add 2 people and I don't put them on a team, I'm just going to treat them like shared services, and I can drop another $4 million worth of revenue by the end of the year, don't you think they're going to be interested in doing that? Of course they are, right? Well, they should be, assuming competent management. Anyway, you want to be able to effectively plan availability for teams, roles, and people across epics, projects, and operations work as well. You need to be able to do this in a diversity of delivery methodologies. You should be able to determine cost, availability, and delivery impacts whenever you want to interject new work into your enterprise portfolio. Now, I realize that's classically a function of product management, and hopefully those product managers align, to a heavy extent to an art that they have good communication with. But the fact of the matter is, many, many times they don't. I worked with one organization where they rolled out a wonderful digital art. It was great, it was performing very well. But about 2 years in, they had a big release, came out, and that thing had to sit on the shelf for 6 months because compliance had no availability to review the boilerplate that was required to go out with that particular release, right? So it does take coordination on the front end to make sure that your epics and projects are meeting their expectations from delivery on the back end. Also, how nice is it to be able to have a confident discussion with anybody in the C-suite about what capabilities are actually going to be deliverable this year, given current budget and resources? That can be a very challenging discussion, right? Because we are taught essentially that we want to optimize our planning in increments, right? And so I come across many release train engineers that do that very, very well. And there's a lot of wonderful tools out there to help them do that. Jira, ADO, Rally, whatever you might be using, right? That's great. But who's doing the planning that's a little bit farther out? So we're going to talk about that as we go. One of the things that needs to be done in terms of planning at scale, like your ability to actually deliver, which is fully dependent on your resources that are available to deliver, again, regardless of how they are typically planning, whether or not they're participating fully in your PI planning sessions, or whether or not they're executing on a waterfall project somewhere, or whether they're an operational team that or shared services required. If you can ensure that they are in fact doing and following best planning practices for their domain, you will all come to realize that, look, everybody, whether or not you're an ops person that uses Excel, best practices, and I would encourage you in this particular case to go out to the Resource Management Institute. There's a plethora of information out there that talks about how best practices in ops planning includes doing longer term resource forecasting and looking at essentially a roadmap, right? You guys are on this call, you're probably familiar with the benefits of doing longer term product planning from product managers, right? Product owners. Those are the people that are feeding you night and day your requirements that are hopefully now in your backlogs, right? Same with waterfall projects, right? They work typically and coordinate with program management to align, related work in programs, and they all do it through roadmaps. One of the things that you get with scaled resource planning is that independent product, project, ops portfolio roadmaps can integrate to form a holistic enterprise roadmap. You can even form a holistic enterprise Kanban as well. I've shown in this particular example, specifically, you've got some well-known scaled agile delivery portfolio Kanban states here. I don't have reviewing or the funnel on here, but assuming you get to the analyzing state, right? That's where you start to do your detailed planning. You push things into the backlog. You work on your MVP. Assuming that you decide to persist, then you go into full delivery. Well, there's no reason why you can't be looking at the same time in the same view at waterfall projects, for example, or in fact, KTLO work, right? Operational work in the same Kanban. A full function enterprise resource planning tool allows you to blend, mix and match all of these types of methodologies, a common timeline. It's really a wonderful thing because then you get to see interdependencies and resource risks across delivery methodologies way before you ever engage in PI planning. You're looking at it 6 to 9 months out here in advance. And it's particularly helpful to make sure that architecture is involved in these discussions early, and we'll talk about that going on. But big advantages to be able to do this under one umbrella. And I would submit to you, it takes not a new best practice, but it's where you do your new best practice in an enterprise resource planning tool, one that supports a consistent view of work on a common timeline. So how do you do that? How do you get epic project and ops work planned across very disparate resources on a common timeline? This can be a challenge even if you're in a pure agile environment. How many of you have engaged in planning discussions where you've had the the, now infamous discussion about, well, hey, we're all using different baselines for our story point forecasting. And yeah, we all follow a Fibonacci sequence and yada, yada, yada. But the fact of the matter is, look, my team is going to tell you for the same amount of work that it's going to take me 22 story points, in a sprint, where the next team walks in and say, we don't really forecast that way. Actually, we think that's only going to be about 15 story points. And they're both 100% correct. And the Agile methodology ostensibly allows for self-forming, self-managed, cross-functional teams, and that approach is wonderful, right? At a team level, it does, when you take it up a notch, make it a little more complicated for how do you do planning, even within the art, right? I routinely work with companies that have arts that have 10 to 12 teams on them, and if each are using a separate approach to story point velocities, if you will, it just makes for a lot more discussion. People are making that work, right? It's just a little bit more challenging, especially as you think about, now, how do I mix those different velocities into requests coming from entities outside of my art, whether it's another art or a project that needs my team for a certain amount of time, or some operational work, and vice versa. How am I going to show that I'm dependent on ops teams that they use Excel, right? How does that work? So a robust enterprise resource planning tool will allow you to use unique velocities from different teams on different arts and map them onto a common timeline. It's very easy, right? The way that we do it is we simply say, what's your velocity? You just let us know on a regular basis. Look, and velocities change over time. When you have new teams, the amplitude of your variance curves are very high, but they will flatten out over time. And you will, in fact, become steady state. In fact, that's one of the tenets of best practices in Agile, as I'm sure most of you know, is to try to be more predictable in your delivery, right? So over time, they will have a more predictable velocity. Typically, I know Jira, ADO, and other tools, they kind of keep a running 90-day track of that, right? So you should be able to cogently say, look, my velocity is approximately 27. I realize it was 33 last time, but that was 6 months ago, and now we're running at about 27 story points, or whatever the number is, right, over the next 2 weeks. What we allow you to do is come in here and set a capacity for your particular teams. In this particular example, I'm showing a couple teams from the federal products art and one from the state and local art, right? These have 4 people, 3 people, 6 people. They've got very different velocities, and you can come in here and estimate in any number of ways. You can put your estimates in story points. You can put your estimates in as, hey, it's going to take 50% of my team, 3 PIs for us to do that. Great. Many different ways you can do this, but because we know your velocities and we map your velocities over time, we're able to put these on a common timeline with other resources or even generic resources that might be forecasting, say, an hour, which is sort of a common practice, certainly for ops work and certainly for project work as well. It's a wonderful thing, and you never have to go have some discussion about, are we going to normalize our velocities, make everybody on the team use the same baseline for story point estimates. You don't have to have any of those discussions. Just tell me by team what your velocity is. Also, without getting too deep here, I've run into a few entities that like to estimate by art. That's not a good practice in my opinion, because what I have found and kind of what common sense dictates is that, look, even though all the teams on your art are in fact related, hopefully, again, if you've got done effective value stream mapping, where you're constrained is typically by team. It's rare that you have a fully cross-functional art in the first place. That's rare. I'm not saying it can't happen, but very, very rare. Typically, you have teams that work together, and there's a reason why people are located on teams, right? The teams perform a unique function, and hopefully the the people within the teams are fairly cross-functional, right? That in and of itself can be a challenge. But assuming that your teams have unique skill sets, then you ought to be forecasting by team to be sure, and not by art. All right, other things that you can do in here, again, putting on your timeline, your internal and external expense timing. This is important because if you're doing participatory budgeting, or frankly, any kind of reasonable budgeting in terms of look ahead, what are my costs for the next 3 months or 6 months, or even though we're 40% of the IT department and we're running Agile, the rest of the world is not, and they're requiring us to engage in annual planning drills. Well, what does this look like for us, right? What if we're going to be purchasing, $4 million worth of, some ITSM software over the course of the next year? How are those payments going to look? We're going to pay them quarterly, $1 million a quarter, right? For this first year, you want to be able to time your expenses on the same timeline. It's important because as you do reporting for your roadmap and planning for your ARC, that you can show where your expenses are. And especially if you're going to engage in some of the best practices that I'm going to talk about here in the next 15 minutes about being able to model your art and model new work. It's wonderful technology that many of our customers are using, and it's really driving productivity in their environment. So a couple of other things here, because I want to leave time for a demo too. Look, what I'm advocating here is it's entirely consistent with the planning horizon best practices that are espoused in SAFe 5.1. Again, I would highly encourage you, if you have not done so, to go out to Scaled Agile Inc. or go to scaledagileFramework.com, click on the diagram that looks like the one I showed at the top of this presentation, and just look out there, just search on planning horizons. And what you will see essentially is likely known by most people here, but look, for the current PI, PIs are typically 12 weeks. They don't have to be, but they typically are. Your resource allocations and your work commitments, if you've done your PI planning correctly, are fixed, right? The work that you're doing now in the current PI should be fixed to the extent that that's possible. There is always unplanned work that comes in, and hopefully you've set aside sufficient capacity based on historical precedent to address that. But even if you haven't, we'll talk about that in just a minute. But the goal certainly should be fixed. As you look out for the next couple of PIs, you need to be flexible, and you need to be explaining this to those that are interested in what's coming down the pipeline, your C-suite, senior executives, whomever that may be. Look, our cost and resource estimates have to be flexible here. Otherwise, we're missing out on some of the key benefits that are driving our transition to Agile in the first place, right? And then when you get out here to essentially PI +3, sure, you still want to estimate out that far? You absolutely should. And why do I say 12 months? Because you have finance and accounting people that need to plan for this on a 12-month planning horizon, right? They need to know how much capitalization. As it turns out, stockholders, board members, risk oversight committees, they all care about these things. So you can't just pretend they don't exist. You have to plan for them. And it's exactly why SAFe and other best practices, waterfall planning, program planning, GOTS, PMI, RMI again, they all advocate the same thing, right? You can't not do this. I mean, you can not do it, but you're going to set yourself up for failure, and that failure is going to manifest itself right here at the PI boundary. So an analogy that I like to use is, look, out here, you need to be planning your travel. You need to be aligning your work and resources for optimal enterprise strategy delivery. What are the business outcomes that you are seeking? Right here is where you need to be doing that alignment, all out here, right? All the independent product program roadmaps, if they integrate well, and if you're using a common enterprise resource planning tool, they'll fold into one enterprise roadmap where you can not only see your interdependencies across delivery methodologies, but you can compare them to whatever your LPM guardrails are. We're going to talk about that in a minute. Obviously, seeing your risks early, helps actually facilitate PI planning and delivery. But it really is like doing a travel itinerary. I have a family member that's headed to Spain here next month, and for the last 3 months, they've been lining up their itinerary. They're going to go to Madrid, Barcelona. Yay, if we have anybody from Spain out there, I've learned more about Spain. It's a great place. I actually want to go visit it now, right? But when they get to Spain, now they're going to be doing the more detailed stuff, right, that you do inside of PI planning. And again, JIRA and ADO and these tools, they are wonderful at doing work decomposition, story point forecasting, things at a PI level. But you need to be looking at this holistically out here. And I submit to you that you need an enterprise resource planning tool to do that. How does this work, right? Again, one of the challenges I said, and I don't want to fall into the trap, is, look, so many of us read about this stuff, and it's a little bit ivory tower. But how do you actually do this? And I'm going to spend a little bit of time on here, and this is really the money slide in this presentation, right? Which is, if you look at this top line, those of you that are familiar with the Scaled Agile framework will see, oh, yeah, this actually looks a lot like the portfolio Kanban. That's because that's where I've taken this from, and full credit to them to do so. I've added a couple steps in here because this is how entities actually get work done. So I want to walk through this, if you will. And I'm going to look at the bottom first, and I'm going to introduce a new concept right here and right here, because this is the kind of innovation that it talks about in the House of Lean, right? When things come along, we ought to be open to the notion of, hey, how can I use that innovation to actually help me get more work done? So what I'm proposing is, look, consistent with what it says in the Scaled Agile framework. Once you get through the reviewing process, this is sort of a go, no go, right? This is typically almost always done on strictly a financial basis. They go in, architecture's involved in this, hopefully, and you look at effort, cost, and independencies and make a go, no go decision. Are we in fact going to do that work? Well, great, I hope that you do. But then you move from there, assuming that you decide that you are, into the analyzing phase. And down here, if you will, underneath, you can see that I've sort of laid this out a little bit more graphically. The first thing you want to do is you want to break up your work into an MVP. It's a best practice, right? Minimum viable product. Look at that epic in detail and break it out by effort, by team and role, assuming that you're likely to have both that are required to deliver your effort, right? And look at the interdependencies. Put them in your enterprise resource planning tool. When you put them in, you should immediately see whether or not on the requested timeline that you have, that these teams or people or generic roles have any availability whatsoever, right? If they don't, then that's your first clue that you better go start discussions right away, right? Because ultimately you're heading for approval here. And there are typically a series of approval steps that need to happen. You need to meet with architecture. You've got to get pre-approval from finance to make sure everybody understands the expense and balance sheet impacts of these things, right? It's all good. But what we're suggesting is, look, you've got a series of things that you have to go through. Your enterprise guardrails are laid out for you, whether you understand them as guardrails or not. This thing's going to have some kind of relative priority to work that's already in flight and other work that's in the queue, other proposals. There's obviously budget impacts. It's likely that your CFO may have provided the EPMO or whatever governing body is over this process some sort of a bogey for the year. Look, we're going to keep our total spend under whatever, $90 million a year, pick a number, right? Whatever's relevant to your particular organization. They want to know about work type mix. If they don't, they should, right? I mean, why wouldn't you want to see and understand that last year, 40% of my work went to risk mitigation efforts? Well, I'd actually like to drop that considerably, assuming that I can. I'm in a position to do so. I mean, if you're under 25 MRAs and that's driving everything that you're doing, well, I feel badly for you, and I understand why your work mix is out of whack. But hopefully, your executives will look at this and say, I'd like to make sure that whatever percent, 30% of my projects at least, are geared towards driving new revenue or customer retention, right? Instead of just risk mitigation and ops. And whatever your work type mix, it's going to be unique to your industry and your organization, but it ought to be a consideration, right? Other guardrails, again, that are typically not well planned at this state are the availability risks. It's extremely common. We run into it all the time that organizations have more money than people. I mean, in Salt Lake City, our unemployment rate right now is 1%. If you've done any reading at all, you're probably aware of the fact that here in America, 47 million people in 2021, 47 million, according to the Labor Department, willingly changed their job, meaning they left their old position and went to a new position, right? A huge change, unprecedented numbers, right? All kinds of reasons for that, COVID and yada, yada, yada. But, availability of resources needs to be incorporated into your lean business case, should be. What are your concurrency and WIP limits? Again, we're going to talk about it a little bit, but even if people are available, do you have them doing 8 things at the same time? Because if you go out and look at the reasons why people left their jobs, much of it had to do with dissatisfaction with their current working environment. They didn't feel empowered. They felt like they were being asked to do too many things simultaneously, hence the concurrency risk here, or they were just being asked to put in, consistently 55 to 60 hours a week, and they were just done with it, right? So what we're suggesting is look at those guardrails and actually model your delivery sequence. You see, what you can do in a full function enterprise resource planning tool is you create your new work as a proposal. If you do it as a proposal, then you can, without alerting anybody else, letting these resource managers know that I'm considering using this person, your skill set, these 3 teams on these 5 arts. Before anybody has access to that, a product manager, program manager, or anybody that you decide to give access to the modeling tool can go out, create this, size this effort, have these discussions, and then model the sequence. Say, where should we put this? And your tool, your adaptive portfolio planning tool, which is now being fed by estimates that come directly from subject matter experts on your teams or with specific role expertise, right? They come in here and they model the best placement. They identify what the risk mitigations are, and they compare that to how it's going to impact guardrails across the whole darn portfolio. All your production data, right? They do that in a modeled environment. It's very, very slick. It's very innovative. And people that are doing this are able to plan their work and reduce the mitigations that they actually meet at the PI planning boundary substantially. Once you find that optimal mix here, where am I going to stick it? That should be included in your lean business case. You should be able to walk into whatever approving funding bodies that you have and say, boom, not only, hey, this is what we think it's going to cost. Here's your deliverable. Here is your business case in terms of business value, cost of delivery, however, whatever your algorithm is for justification for this entity. And then be able to say confidently, we think we can do it here, right? Because we've modeled, and that's the earliest opportunity we have for availability, unless you want to move this work, right? And hopefully you have modeled also those options, right? Look, if we can move this, this, and this work, now we can push this up, and we'll actually see better flow in terms of business value through the portfolio as a whole. It's a wonderful thing to be able to do, and anyone should be able to do this. Obviously, not anyone can approve this, but anyone should be able to have that discussion and do that planning level. What a wonderful tool to give your product planners, right? All right, once it's approved, then the release train engineers, the resource managers, even those resource managers from business partners from business lines that don't traditionally work in terms of a project delivery like compliance, audit, regulatory, legal, they can go out and actually reserve capacity now on the roadmap in your production system, consistent with this. They'll set aside capacity for program epics, if you're an RTE, and when in fact that time comes, approximately at that time, you're going to be able to see the stuff showing up in your backlogs, right? And you should have capacity because you reserved it way back here. This approval might occur months prior to when the MVP actually starts. And there's nothing wrong with that. That's entirely consistent with agile delivery. In fact, I would tell you that actually makes you more agile, right? If you're able to plan and get some visibility here with the understanding that things can move, because you're out here in the flexible and fluid zone, right? You're not into the fixed zone yet. If you're doing this kind of planning inside your PI, you're way too late. This is portfolio level planning, and you should be aligning your roadmap to meet your overall enterprise business objectives. And you can do that across all delivery methodologies, right? And show the interdependencies between them, right? The assumption always is that nothing is in stone. Even though your capacity is reserved, nothing gets committed until the PI boundary in PI planning. And everybody should understand that. And that also is consistent with good, safe flow, right? And then once you're working on your MVP, now you do the same thing for the full, right? You should assume that there's going to be a persevere decision. Go ahead and detail size this, right? You actually shirt sized it way back here because you've got to give the approving body, if they're worth their salt, some idea what the whole gig's going to cost, right? I know what the MVP is going to cost, but if we decide to persevere, and we wouldn't be here if we didn't think we weren't going to persevere, then here's what the overall cost is. They may cut it right at that point, right? And that's their prerogative. But assuming you go forward and now you're delivering with MVP, then you do the same thing. You model after your MVP is underway, you do a detailed sizing for your full, and you do the same thing here. Model the full implementation against your current guardrails, which are now different. And here's the thing about guardrails. As soon as you introduce new work into your portfolio, you actually change your guardrails. They're quite dynamic. Your work type mix changes, right? If you're putting something that's going to take 7% of the overall entity's resources on a certain effort, then however you're looking and measuring your work type mix, either if it's by hours or total dollars spent, internal labor, whatever your guardrail looks like for that work type mix, you're dynamically changing that. And you just need to understand that. You're obviously changing the budget and the resource impacts as well. You just need a model, find the ideal date to start it. Hopefully it's right on the tails of your NPV, right? And you go on down the road. But things happen over the course of this. There might be some high priority work, with a $10 million, business value associated with it that dwarfs whatever you're working. Great, right? Put this on hold, put it in. This allows you to be completely adaptive, but with data to back it up. All right. The reason we suggest this, by the way, is the same reason why you do Agile in the first place. Look, if you're continually getting feedback in terms of your teams and your release trains, it's good business, right? The customer's engaged in that, and you get better cumulative outcomes. I would submit to you that the same principle holds true for portfolio delivery. You should, in fact, be continually getting feedback from your stakeholders as you're planning your ongoing portfolio. Because how else are you going to optimize value flow over the entire pipeline of enterprise work, especially when you're doing it over mixed methodologies? All right, how does this work? So you actually get a model here. And again, you can have multiple models, right? You can have multiple roadmaps. Common business cases, we see roadmaps built by product, right? They come in here, and rather than doing this in Visio, right, they come in and do it in a data-driven format. They can see where there's over allocations on any given project. They can see where there's concurrency risks. They can see their interdependencies, right? And when you flip over here, you can have a model that mirrors either the enterprise portfolio, their particular portfolio, their product portfolio, if you will, or any other combination. You can filter on these and say, look, for my portfolio, show me only the work that's being done by the federal art or by the federal and the IT art, right? It's any of those things. But the trick is that you're getting foresight feedback long before the PI boundary. You can come in and see exactly what happens if I introduce new work, what happens if I crash work, right? Now I'm going to show you that real quickly. I'm aware of the fact that I've only got 15 minutes left, and I'm going to try to wrap this up here in about 5, demo, and then leave some time for questions. All right. So if you're going to have truly adaptive portfolio management, models and feedback loops can certainly help. They can help optimize your product and project delivery. And again, this is my take on what are typical guardrails for portfolio planning. You've obviously got priorities, you have availability. You can't deny that. If people are keeping their mid-range planning current, then you'll see those. You've got in-flight interdependencies and work type mix. We talked about that, and obviously financial impacts. All right, benefits from doing this. Look, in this domain, if you're inside of the PI, you've clearly done good planning, hopefully. So it's giving you insight, and you have hindsight, right? You have all these wonderful statistics that ADO and JIRA can produce in terms of, what's my velocity, what have I done in the past, where am I going, sort of a thing. But what you get over here, if you're working using Foresight feedback loops, you're actually getting real foresight. You're looking at where can I stack these things up, what's coming next. I can set a realistic 12-month value delivery and cost expectation with the C-suite, right? These are the things that it looks like we're going to do. And rather than saying, hey, I can tell you for sure what we're going to do here, and we're likely to be able to do it here, it's a much better discussion, I can assure you, when you say, yep, I can tell you for sure what we're doing here, but I can tell you based on our best estimates from subject matter, experts across the products, ops teams, and release train engineers, for the next 3 PIs, we're likely going to be delivering these here, here, and here, assuming, Mr. or Mrs. C-suite, that we don't get any new work coming in that's unplanned. But you understand that we're flexible here and we're fluid here, right? It makes for a much more informed, better discussion. Besides the fact that you get to see a comprehensive view of everything that's going on in the enterprise, to the extent that you have people participating and using a common enterprise resource planning tool. You get to routinely optimize the sequence of your 12-month delivery. It's a nice thing. Whatever your portfolio planning cadence is, if you're having regular portfolio syncs on a monthly basis, quarterly basis, strategic portfolio reviews, great. You ought to be incorporating modeling into that. You ought to walk into that meeting and already have modeled what you think your likely adjustments are going to be, and what are the risk mitigations that you're going to take to account for over allocations or timing inconsistencies, right? Again, your product roadmaps, they can flow into a common roadmap to give you that view. And obviously, now you can reserve capacity for your teams and roles well in advance, early enough to matter. You can have discussions about hiring. It typically takes 90 to 180 days in today's environment to hire and bring someone on board. But if you have a warm pool of resources, maybe you can cut that down. I've been consulting with a university over the last 2 weeks. You couldn't find an entity with a warmer pool of resources, if you will, because they have access to students. But even then, it takes them 90 days to onboard someone. So you just have to plan for that. So you need to see where you can make these adjustments early enough to matter. All right, here's another thing I want to highlight here. You can actually design availability and concurrency mitigations right into your planning process. You can see if what you're doing is going to be clobbering certain roles and people. And you ought not to do that, I would submit to you. It's not a great retention plan. One of the favorite reports that I used to run in my old team was we look across the whole organization and say, show me everybody that's worked 55 to 60 hours a week over the last 90 days. And then I would blend that with the next report that says, show me everybody that is planning to work, right? The next, 90 days, 55, 60 hours a week. And lots of times it's the same people. And the message they're getting is, look, the floggings are going to continue. And then, and this report was particularly irritating to certain executives, I would map that against who are our single-threaded resources, which is something that I don't have time to talk much about in this meeting, but we have a wonderful way for you to track people by role and by skill set, right? And you can map that to your HR system, see what people's aspirations are, and consider using your actual pending demand that you now have foresight into seeing into what people's skill sets are and what their desired skill sets are. So maybe you can look at a little bit of internal recruiting effectively before you have to go outside, right? What that does is it allows you also to make sure that you are not putting your people consistently under duress. And I promise you this will help your ongoing retention. Of course it will. But when you're constantly making these adjustments right here, that can be a challenge, because at this point, you got to get work through the pipeline. You should have figured that out way out here. And that's what the Foresight feedback really helps you with. And frankly, it's why Scaled Agile and the PMI and RMI all recommend good best practices in roadmap and resource planning. So again, I'm not advocating anything new about what the best practices are. What I am saying is you should, in fact, just follow best practices, but you've got to do it in the right place where you can actually get visibility across the enterprise to all the availability risks that are actually coming at you. All right, so that's basically what I said here. Look, you need to model your delivery sequence. You need to look at your risk mitigations, and then once you update your product, actually your production enterprise roadmap to map the model, you've got all kinds of good things coming your way, right? And you're consistent with your guardrails. I'm going to skip this. This really is talking about the impact on teams. Again, there's not much impact here at a team level. I'll just brush over this basically because I know I'm running out of time here. But all we're asking, in terms of net new ask here is, look, just let your people plan like they should. Let them provide the subject matter experts for the new epics or projects that are entering into the portfolio queue. Once they hit the analyzing state, these good people are the ones that ought to be providing the estimates. Epic owners, project managers, they should make sure that every resource that's needed for the project, to the extent that they understand it, are in fact estimated, right? It's this is exactly what the Scaled Agile framework says we should do. Epic owners should plan to shepherd their epics through the portfolio Kanban. They might be needed for the life of the epic through the Kanban, right? It's not just while you're putting the lean business case together. And the same, of course, is true for project managers. Release train engineers, they're similar to resource managers in as much as they should be looking at their skill sets, which in fact are teams for them. And you can see here that where they need to be spending their time is outside the PI boundary. Look, all this is done inside of JIRA, right? We're not asking you to do double work here. No, what we are saying is that if you're not doing this longer term horizon planning, right? And especially in this 1 to 3 PIs out, then you are selling yourself short. It just takes one good resource arbitration challenge to eat up all the time that you would spend if you did this 1 to 2 hours a month. It's not a heavy lift here. And the reward, it's consistent with best practices, but the reward is big. Resource managers should be doing the same thing. Most of them already are. They're just doing this in Excel, right? And our take is, look, do it in the resource planning tool. That way everybody can see not only what you're working on, but what you're not able to work on, right? Because your ops team is overallocated, right? It allows for roll-up planning, truly adaptive portfolio management. What portfolio management needs to do is they need to make sure that they've got everybody essentially following best practices, right? They themselves need to be using a common enterprise roadmap, which hopefully just forms by itself by the integration of all the individual roadmaps that are being used by ops planners, project managers, resource managers, and release train engineers, right? They're the ones that make sure that the whole enchilada is staying within the approved guardrails. All right, last slide here, critical success factors. Look, people have to plan beyond the PI boundary. I love this quote by Neil Maxwell: you should never sacrifice what you want the most for what you want at the moment. It could not be truer, when looking at adaptive portfolio management and how do I make this actually work? You got to have a practical forecasting and capacity reservation process. People need to understand that, look, not everybody has to do all of this. If everybody will just do their part and do it in a common tool, it'll flow together, right? It just naturally flows together as to what comes out of it. You've got to have a little bit of accountability. You need to make sure that everybody who needs to comes to your routine portfolio planning events. They need to be reporting risk mitigation activities, right? And you need to have a reasonable policy out here generally that says, look, you should be forecasting whichever your methodology is, work out for the next 12 months. Teams are never committed until PI planning, right? And it does take a common enterprise planning tool to do this. Let me show you real quick. And I waxed a little bit long there, so my apologies. So I'm going to dive right into this, this planning tool, right? So this is just one model. You can have many, but real quickly, because I want to leave just time to answer a couple of questions if I may. And look, if I can't get to your questions, we'll answer them. I will respond to you via email if you're submitting questions to Greg right now. But this is an example of a portfolio up here that's using people from all these different departments, I should say. And here's an example of, look, the federal art, if you will. It looks like it's actually doing pretty well in terms of overall allocation here. And you can adjust dates and all that kind of stuff. But if you look here, you've got the mechanical team. That's 125% allocated. They're never going to get that work done in July. The good news is you're having this discussion in April. Your PI planning's in May. So you're trying to get out in front of this thing. So if you look here, you can see, oh, great. Got a lot of work here. It's going to be easiest for me to make some adjustments to the hypersonics project, right? So if you come up here to the hypersonics project, you can do all kinds of things. Say, look, what happens if I push this out? And you can see down below, right? You're starting now to spread dynamically this workload further out onto the planning horizon. You can do all kinds of interesting modeling techniques here. You can decide if you're going to crash this thing, everybody goes crazy, right? You can even come in here and say, look, it's really this team that's the problem. What happens if I come in here and I fatten my team over this time frame, right? So what if I add a person? What is that going to do to this? Well, it drops you from 167% down to 133. Well, that's not good enough. What if I add a second person to my team, right? Update the preview. Okay, now this is something I can walk in the door, to a higher level manager and say, look, we're in trouble here from July through November. But if you add 2 people to my team with these skill sets, then I can get this done. And the good news is it's April. We should start hiring now if this is an option. Or the other option is, what do I want to do? Like, where am I going to push this work? And so if you want to look at, what are options for hypersonic, we actually have a very clever optimization tool in here. It's called the opportunity map. And you can look out here and say, look, what are my options? Where else can I start this project if I need at least 22% availability from all my resources? If I drop that down, you start to get more options. Option 6 looks attractive, right? I can see what the impacts are. Now I blew that away because I crashed the project, right? But again, you can look at that by named person. You can filter on roles. If there's only one team that's a problem, you can filter this down to a given team, right? What if it's the mechanical team? Where can I find that these guys are available? So I would encourage you, please, if you're interested in learning more about this, please reach out to Greg. Let me pop back here to the, you're happy, great to have you reach out to me as well. Let me go back to full screen here. Greg, I don't know if you're still on. If you are, I don't know if you have any questions that have come in, but if not, we're very near the top of the hour. I'd like to thank again all of you all for participating today. We would in fact love to take your questions, set up a demonstration. It's very common for us to set up trials, 90-day trials. It's very low overhead for us to be able to do that. So if you'd like to pursue this conversation, any part of it, feel free to reach out to me or to Greg. Thank you so much for your time and attendance today.